United States is running a 2%, or excuse me, $2 trillion deficit with full employment. Global GDP is about $100 trillion, growing nominally about 6% per year. So every year, there is about $6 trillion in GDP, new GDP growth. The United States needs to consume $2 trillion of that just to finance deficits at full employment. If the US has a recession, that number goes to 3 trillion or more, while the 6 trillion comes down. This is why you start to see the federal government borrowing, crowding out global dollar markets and global rates markets. What do you see? You see the dollar go up, paradoxically, and you see rates go up. As the US federal government borrowing crowds out the global private sector, the dollar rises, rates rise, the global economy slows, US tax receipts fall, we go back to one. As tax receipts fall, deficits rise, wash, rinse, repeat. This chart tells you there is nothing the federal government can cut to stop the deficits from growing. They can't cut entitlements anytime soon in sufficient amounts. They can cut interest expense, but they would have to cut rates dramatically, which is highly inflationary. Or they could slash defense. And if they slash defense, we basically pack up, we come home from Eurasia, we give Chinese and the Russians what they want, and we move on. That ain't happening either. So the result is going to be inflation. It's a virtual certainty, barring a productivity miracle. This is a chart that is a simple ratio. It is the price of gold over the price of long-term US Treasury bond futures. The red arrow is when the global central banks stopped growing holdings of treasuries. Since that time, the price of gold has outperformed long-term US Treasuries by over 3x. These are two assets that should ultimately, treasuries should outperform. They pay an interest rate, gold does not. The message here is that the United States fiscal situation, which many think is a crisis yet on the come, it began 2 years ago. Gold is telling us the United States has a fiscal crisis, not tomorrow, not in 5 years. It started in 2022. It's getting worse. It's going to continue to get worse. As they said in Jaws, the implications as for US policymakers is you're going to need a bigger boat, or in this case, a bigger Fed balance sheet. I hear all the time, the US is just going to be Japan. Japan has a bigger debt problem than we do, and they haven't had a problem. What this chart tells you, if the US is just going to be Japan, imagine if the Fed's balance sheet is 60% of US GDP, or roughly 15 or $17 trillion. Or if it's 100% of GDP, if the Fed's balance sheet goes to $25 trillion, it's going to be very inflationary. And ultimately, that's why gold. It's not the end of the world. It's just the end of a financialized era in the United States. And I would expect gold to continue outperforming long-dated US Treasury bonds, long-dated bonds, and long-dated Western sovereign bonds in total.